companies as CISOs and security consultants. He has helped many companies transform their practices, and that's what he loves doing. And today he's here to talk about the very thing where he's going to start with how to scale from SOC 2 as a foundation. Without any further ado, I'm just going to bring Matthew to the center stage and have him take over.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'm definitely excited to be here today. As Arthi was saying, I've been around the block. I've worked with more than 10 different cybersecurity frameworks, have dealt with a lot of collisions of frameworks and compliance models over the years. So happy to be here. So thank you. So what are we covering today? We're going to do exactly what we were talking about. We're going to talk about the SOC 2 as a starting point for building organizations. We're going to look at the challenges of continual compliance, reporting, how do you navigate some of the audits, how do you deal with some of the challenges, and how do you scale beyond SOC 2? I mean, this is all part of that bigger picture. Of course, we'll look at a few of the tools and tactics to ensure compliance as well. So a bit of housekeeping. This is a 20-minute talk. There's a lot that I could go into, so I'm going to be skimming over some topics. Definitely feel free to ask questions a little bit later. I'm going to save the questions for after my talk, just so I can cover the basics. I do assume you've got some basic knowledge of SOC 2 and of cybersecurity, so I'm not going to explain the one-on-one level concepts today. And I do assume a little bit of technical knowledge, but I'm going to try to be very high level with some of this stuff. So let's start with scaling with SOC 2. So obviously there's a lot of different types, and this is very important. So we're going to be looking at scaling within SOC 2. So for example, there's a report type of type 1, type 2, type 3. And there's a lot of differences that are very important for people to be aware of when you're focusing on that. Because a type 1, they have the exact same control set when you're talking about, a type 1 versus a type 2. And I'm not going to go too deep, but a type 1 audit, you have to show some example that you did the right thing. And so if you're going through a change control process, for example, and you have to show one example over a course of 3 months or a year that you happen to have done something right, your organization is probably not quite up to speed. There's a big difference between somebody who's been through an organization, a type 2 audit or type 1 audit once versus somebody who's been through a type 2. What's different about a type 2 is the assessment criteria that go into it. That's under the SSAE 18. And so when you're talking about a type 2, what that's going to do is, let's say if you've got 100 different changes that took place, the auditors may look at 5 different changes, take a look at it, and go from there. So that means that they're probably have found several findings if they're making mistakes on a continual basis, if they've been through it for 5 years. And so it kind of gives you an idea what the culture is of the organization. How prepared are you? So taking a look at that when you're starting to scale into other frameworks from SOC 2 or type 1, type 2, it's a big difference between the two because your organization may or may not be up to speed. The other thing to do is take into account scope. As I mentioned, you could do a 3-month SOC 2 assessment. If you have a 3-month SOC 2, that's very different than a year. And so understanding what that scope is very important. If you've only done one 3-month assessment, you're probably not doing too well, but at least you've got some of the basic mechanisms in place when you're trying to scale out. So once you go from like a 3-month into a year, that can be a very small change for your organization, or it could be a large change for your organization. It all depends on what the approach is, how many people have buy-in from a cultural perspective, and so on. And the other thing is when you take into account the systems, you could say, for example, your Active Directory controller could be the scope, and that's perfectly okay. Yes, you've got to meet, you have a firewall, you've got to have change control, you've got to have intrusion detection systems, antivirus, all of those types of things. But they're going to check to make sure that it's okay on your AD systems. They're not going to go ahead and check other types of systems. So all of this starts to give you an idea, where are you really at? Because you have to understand your starting point before moving forward. Also on the right-hand side here, you'll notice that there are principles, security, availability, and confidentiality are the typical ones most organizations follow. But if, let's say, you follow availability and you haven't done, and you need to move to process integrity or privacy, that could be a big change for your organization as well. So you have to understand the basics of where you're at and where you need to go in order to figure out how to scale properly within a SOC 2. So there's a lot of things. As I said, you really need to understand the basics. What are the problems? What are the challenges that your organization is facing? There could be changes, especially when you start to look at some other frameworks down the road. There could be changes in the law, so you need to change what you're doing. That can occasionally affect some of the compliance, even within a SOC 2 environment. Maybe you need to maintain it. Maybe there's changes. For example, PCI is making a change from 3.2.1 to 4.0. But also maybe you want stronger governance. You feel like the governance process is not adequate within your organization. Maybe consider something like a SOC 2 is a good place to go, or maybe you need to take a look at some of the other practices. If you want to include privacy, which is becoming more of a concern within the United States, why not work with a SOC 2? So just understanding what the requirements are is important, but also understand the business impact. What does this mean for the various departments? Do you have their buy-in? Do you know what that's going to be like? Have you discussed what that's going to mean and what are the requirements in there? I'm very big on creating allies across the organization as well. I think that's an important stepping stone, but also make the formal business case. In some cases, you don't need to do it. Maybe it's you've already gone through it, or you know what the business case is. You've been talking about it for years and everybody's on board, but make a business case. I think these are really important to scaling out from SOC 2. Next slide. So there are challenges. The cultural interest, that buy-in is incredibly important for many organizations. But one thing I like to do is understand what the gaps are. Take a look at the controls, take a look at the new controls, and see if you can do that. Quite often, and this is going to be true whether you're scaling, to a different framework or scaling within that, understand what those gaps are. I like to have an outside auditor come in and do a gap assessment prior to doing the audit, because sometimes they're going to look at things in a slightly different way than you are. Because the reality is, when you're going through a SOC 2, a lot of it is going to depend on the auditors that you bring in. Some auditors are going to be very specific. Other ones are going to be like, they'll let a lot of stuff go. It sometimes even depends on the particular person, not just the agency that you're working with. So these are important considerations when you're considering a SOC 2. There's also increased cost. You have to look at more controls. You're going to look at things from a slightly different angle. More people have to be involved. And so this becomes a greater consideration for your organization. Cost could be part of that challenge. You can be part of the scaling issues that you're going to be running into. So these are just a few of the basics here. Next slide. So there's a lot of other things that might pop up from a SOC 2 perspective. Maybe you have new locations. Mergers and acquisitions can bring some things. Sometimes you're going to bring in brand new compliance requirements as a result of M&A activity, mergers and acquisitions. But for example, and probably all of us who have dealt with scaling out have seen issues like this. Maybe you don't have a place to store a server. Let's say you've got an Active Directory server that for local logins and things, or maybe you don't have a place that you can put a firewall. It's going to be out with the average user. Is that really secure? Most of us are going to say no, but it's, is one of those concerns that you have to take a look at. And I've been through a lot of mergers and acquisitions in my time. So when you're dealing with that, you really have to understand what the organization is all about. How similar of a business is it to the one that you have? There's differences in SOC 2 based on the types of data and how you approach some of that, how the auditors are going to approach it. So you have to take those things into account. For example, if you do not have HIPAA data in your environment and you then need to bring in HIPAA, how is that going to impact you from both a SOC 2 perspective, or what are the new compliance requirements that are going to start to jump in as a result of that? These are additional demands. You have to be very thoughtful in your approach in what you're going to do. I touched briefly on the physical security challenges, but also understand, how does this impact lines of business? How can you separate some of these challenges? For example, in some cases, you can't have the same email system for multiple areas when you're starting to cross some of the zones within your organization. So these are just a couple of things to consider. When you start to acquire other companies, they could have a separate legal entity, or you could decide to merge them into your legal entity. There's just so many different factors that are going to go into that. And that's something to take carefully. Next slide. So we're going to get now, I know I've started to touch on it, scaling beyond SOC 2 to look at compliance with other frameworks. Next slide. So there's a whole bunch in here. And this is not a complete list. It is a little bit US centric. I'm not trying to say this is going to include everything that's out there. I've done a good chunk of this, not everything here. But generally the way I look at it, the frameworks over to the left-hand side tend to be easier than the frameworks over to the right-hand side. And there's going to be exceptions to that. A couple of you may notice that HITRUST is on there twice. That's on purpose. They are a very interesting framework, and it's going to be very valuable to consider something like framework when you're starting to scale beyond SOC 2. What's interesting about them is they've got a framework which incorporates other frameworks. So you can get multiple things done at once. You can get your SOC 2 in there. You can get your HITRUST and FFIEC if you want to, all within one framework. And it makes things so easy for a lot of organizations to do. And it saves you a lot of that GRC work on the back end because they've already determined all the controls that you need to meet, and it's going to be part of that process. So if we start over on the left-hand side, though, we've got NIST CSF. That's the cybersecurity framework. Hopefully most of you are familiar with it today. Also, there is NYDFS. Now, that one I put over on the easy side, but I want to qualify that because there are some challenges in there that are very big that you don't have to meet anywhere else, but the number of controls tends to be a little bit smaller than what you're going to find in other organizations. Like one interesting change that happened in New York DFS since I've done it, you have to get sign off with the CEO and the CISO saying, yep, we've got sufficient staff to get things done. You know, how many organizations are going to be comfortable with that? How many CISOs are going to be comfortable with that? So when you're scaling out, you really need to understand what you're stepping into. You know, PCI DSS, that's for credit cards. There's roughly 400 controls. You're dealing with, you know, a ballpark of 100 of SOC 2. So when you look at these, it can be a big change. You know, you could argue that NIST 853, for example, there's a little above 300 controls. But if you break down all the individual portions of it, it's close to 1,500 controls. But again, depending on how you want to read the controls, because there are a lot of subcomponents within the controls. But anyway, there is a tremendous amount going on here. And I do think that it's important to take these, but I look at these, compliance is a journey. Sometimes you need to move quickly. You need to get over to FedRAMP. I spent years doing NIST 853, so I'm pretty familiar with those controls. But, you know, sometimes it's a stepping stone. You can't get, you know, from 1 to 100 very quickly. You've got to speed up gradually over time. And that's part of what I think is so important about SOC 2. So definitely there are challenges, the existing locations. And what you might find, let's say you're SOC 2 compliant, you want to add something else. There may be new physical security requirements that weren't there before. So that takes up a whole new challenge, and you need to really vet the organization and understand the locations and understand what those compliance gaps are. You know, the other thing too, when you talk to auditors, and I've actually run into organizations, I have not done this myself, but organizations where you have individual people running the whole organization off of personal computers, but they're SOC 2 compliant because they have everything up in the cloud for what they access and how they do things. Now that's against a lot of the SOC 2 that's out there, but there are certain ways that you can get compliant depending on the auditors that you're working from. And so understanding those scopes can be a big issue. So especially when you start to add in additional requirements, that can be a big challenge. But there's some rules of thumb that you can follow. Now, everything that I'm about to say, I have seen exceptions to this. So you can't follow this. It's something that's really important is talking to your auditors, finding out, is this reasonable? Like in the federal space, higher to lower compliance for centralization. So what I mean by that is, let's say if you have a SOC and you've got, you know, FISMA, usually you're going to be pretty good to go to a lower compliance like SOC 2, and it's going to be a pretty reasonable thing. But in some cases, you don't need to go that far. You really don't. You know, you probably are not going to be able to share emails between a non-FISMA compliant and a FISMA compliant area, you know, because especially when you're dealing with the whole Office 365 suite, that ends up being a large challenge. But, you know, some cases though, like I've been with HITRUST and with SOC 2, well, if you're coming in from a SOC 2 environment and you're going into HITRUST, then all you would need to do in many cases, make sure that if you have a SOC or like Security Operations Center, there's a huge difference in there. So there's definitely a lot of things that you can take into account, but they require that you have separate the email environments, but you make sure that you've got antivirus and basic patching and stuff, and you're probably going to be okay. The other thing to take into account, I've also run into this issue, not all audit firms are able to handle all types of compliance. Some are very good at some types of compliance, while others are good at other types of compliance. Whatever you're going to, you want to make sure that you're able to meet all of those recordings and all of those challenges. So the big challenge there, we can finish up there. When you're dealing with the auditors, that's where a lot of those challenges come in, because they're going to have brand new requirements that they're going to bring in, especially if you work with a larger audit firm. They want to customize their compliance to what they think you need to do. So that becomes yet another challenge, just dealing with SOC 2 itself, but also going to be a challenge when you're moving away from it. They may add additional controls that may not be part of that SOC 2 compliance framework. So it definitely ends up being a huge challenge for organizations, because you've got to make sure that you're in lockstep. So whenever you do a big change, definitely make sure that you bring the auditors and you do that assessment and make sure that you're jumping through the hoops in the appropriate way. Next slide. So there's a lot of impacts too. Not all compliance frameworks are easy. Sometimes you're going to need to hire more staff. You can't do it with one person. Typically speaking, I've seen a couple of exceptions to that. But typically speaking, when you start to level up the level of compliance, you're more towards the right-hand side of the chart than the left. It's absolutely huge. So you have business process impacts that are going to be impacted. So especially in the privacy space, when you start to consider the privacy side of SOC 2 or some of the other privacy frameworks that include privacy, what does that mean? Do you have appropriate data governance? Are you removing the data that you no longer need in your organization? That's an example of business process requirement. Now, that's easy to say, but the implementation of that, a database, it's somewhat easy to do, but when you consider unstructured data throughout your organization, that can be a massive level of effort. And you can also risk getting rid of data that you actually need to store within your organizations. You've got to plan that out, be very strategic about the approach that you're going to be taking, and go from there. Sometimes organizations culturally are just not ready for that. Sometimes these are gigantic lifts depending on the maturity of the organization. I've seen that in some places where they just haven't been updating their devices. They're keeping things for 6-7 years. They're not compliant. Maybe they've got very old systems that are in there. You hear about this time and time again of organizations. You really have to understand what the impacts are to your business and what ultimately is this going to mean. Next slide. So tools, tactics, and strategies to ensure compliance without duplication of effort. So most of us, when we're first starting out, and I put myself under the same guys here, we started with spreadsheets. We have our Excel spreadsheet. We've got a lot of other things that are going on with it. It becomes very easy to start to work with those spreadsheets. And that's not a bad place to get started. What gets challenging is down the road, because you start needing more, especially when you start bringing in multiple frameworks. You can do it with something like HITRUST because it makes things easier, that I spoke about before, but sometimes that gets to be a huge challenge. So I can see I'm getting a little bit short on time, so I'm going to move a little bit faster, but there are configuration management tools. They can pull the configurations off of it. So if you're meeting PCI, for example, a lot of those requirements can be pulled out directly off of the tools, or there are compliance automation tools that can do that. Of course, the compliance automation is not going to cover things like a pen test in the automation. A pen test is a separate activity. So showing the reviews and showing what that maturity is like is sometimes a challenge, but a lot of the GRC tools can start to focus in on that stuff. So there's also a lot of mapping tools that are out there, like there's Secure Controls Framework, there's Unified Compliance Framework. There are tools out there that you can slurp into your GRC tools to see what the minimal requirements are. Now, depending on the organization, the culture, and how you operate, I sometimes like to be very transparent and show exactly what the control is, even if it's a little bit hard to read, then show what the translation is, because people are going to ask questions. Well, what do they mean by this? What does this mean? So sometimes you like to have a full list of what those controls actually are for your organization. Next slide. So tactics and strategies for scaling. I like to keep the scope small, depending on the risk. And the risk is so important when you're focusing on that. Like I've seen organizations that have had, take something like PCI as an example. They've got PCI in one place. They don't have anything in the other. Their main security is over in the PCI because they have to, but they're storing most of the data over in the other part. Well, that's a case where your data is your largest risk, especially if you have something like PII. So you've got to figure out what that balance is for organizations. But that control mapping exercise that you go through, you find out what all the controls are, you map it, try to determine what you're doing. That's an important part of the whole process. Consider what those costs are, figure out what's the best way to do things, and how do you minimize. The more audits you can kind of overlap into one, that can be a huge way to save your time. So you don't have to do the same audits. I've been through like 8 audits in a year, for example. And those get to be challenging. It wears the staff out, especially when you start to do that, but also make considerations for the IT staff. If the IT staff if you're making old school requests and saying, can you please show me what the level of password requirements are for Active Directory, and they take a screenshot, show it's there in the corner, put it up there within a ticketing system, that is a long, grueling process. Anything you can do to save your team some effort by using a tool to be able to pull that information ahead of time is a really great way to do things. And it also can really help you scale that compliance out. Because if you start bringing in, 20 or 30,000 people for a larger organization, it's just overwhelming. So you need to automate as much as possible. Next slide. That's it. So I want to thank everybody for your time today. I know we hammered through a lot of stuff, but I'd love to answer some questions.
Yep. Thank you, Matthew. That was really succinct. And we do have questions coming in. First one is, how do you, I'm just going to cast this. How do you plan such that scaling compliance efforts beyond a framework does not overly burden operational efficiency? Does SOC 2 suffice as a foundation than ISO or NIST to 853?
So anything can be true, but when you're trying to deal with scaling, like from SOC 2 to 853, there's a huge difference between ISO and NIST 853. I mean, 853, as I said, has that close to 1,500 controls, depending on how you want to read that. But it's about creating additional discipline. And so what I think that you can move from 0 to 853, but sometimes it's better to kind of take those intermediate steps and cover just part of it at a time. Other times getting an outside organization to be helpful. Like, for example, I've been working with one company recently, and we're teaching them the A, B's, and C's of compliance. Why is it that they need to do things? What are the important parts of that? And really taking the time to educate them and provide them with this white glove service to explain that. So in some cases, getting people on board is a really critical part of that, because you're talking about a cultural change. You're not just talking about a compliance change. Here's a control, meet the control. You've got to get people on board, find out what the problems are and the challenges. Let's say if you need to make sure that you've got access control lists in both directions for every single VLAN in your organization, that's an operational overhead. That is a massive operational overhead. It sounds simple to say, but if you've got 100 different VLANs and you've got all of these ACLs to create, it's huge. So you have to sit down and talk to people and understand what it's like to do this for your organization. Some things might be easy. Like if you need to change your login screen to say something else, generally speaking, that's going to be pretty easy. You can automate your way through that. You can put some stuff in there, especially if you're using something like Active Directory. That's easy. But when you talk about a lot of the other requirements, it takes a lot of overhead when you're starting to do that. So for me, that gap assessment is very important, and making sure you get the appropriate people who can really walk you through that. And in some cases, I would even recommend organizational change management, but do what you can do to automate. As I said, those GRC tools that can automate that and put that whole process in there is really going to be helpful.
I hope that answered your question. If not, we have linked Matthew's socials. Yeah, you can reach out and connect to him, and he'd be happy to take the conversation forward. I think when you spoke about automation, Igor as well had this question. What about compliance automation platform instead of scaling staff? And we got the question on LinkedIn as well. Hiring more staff versus getting an automation tool. So what's your take on this?
I'm going to give the classic IT answer, because the reality is it depends. If you're dealing with a small organization, let's say if you've got, 10 people and it's a very small place, you've got one Active Directory server, maybe a backup, and that's it. Automation tool can be helpful, but I think it's going to be overkill and it's going to be too much of a cost. So what I try to do is really take a look at the controls that you have, take a look at the requirements that you have, and figure out how do you balance it and figure out what's right. if you're dealing with a tougher compliance framework and there's more specific technical requirements, part of the reason I was bringing up, say, SOC 2 compared to PCI, PCI does have, or sorry, no, instead of SOC 2 instead of PCI, SOC 2 does have a lot of very few requirements in there that are very technical, whereas PCI has a lot of technical requirements that are in it. And therefore, when you go through and doing that assessment, use an automation tool in that particular case. If you need, say, CIS hardening, for example, which can have, if you look at, say, the one for Windows 2000, the Windows server, you're looking at, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of changes. Don't have staff do that. You're going to drive them crazy. Get a tool to install it, get a tool to download it, use scripts if you have to, use an outside company, but don't waste your time spending hundreds of hours recreating the wheel that you can use elsewhere. So when you look at the controls, that's part of it. There's SCAP, there's a bunch of other hardening requirements that can go into things as well. There's US government configuration baselines. There's all kinds of options that are out there. But I would take a look at the level of effort that it takes. If it's just like a few minutes on a staff's time, that shouldn't be a huge issue. If you're talking about a massive overhaul, that's where the issue is. That's how you're going to respond it, and when you're probably going to want an automation tool.
Gotcha. I hope that answered your question. We have one last question. Yeah. So I like the highlight on culture, but how do you measure how well the culture is being accepted in the org? Tricky question.
Yes, it is a tricky one. So there's a couple different ways. The cheeky way is like, well, did you pass the audit? But that's really not where you want to go. There are different types of cultural assessments to kind of look at the buy-in and making sure that you've got that whole process. So sometimes the cultural assessments can be very valuable to see what's going on. Do people understand why things are going on? So that's something. Did you communicate effectively why the organization needs to move in the direction of compliance? If you're not communicating directly, that's where you need to sit down and really consider, what is it like for that organization? That's how you can start to measure it. There's a lot of different options that are out there, but, sometimes sit down and have a conversation with people. Hey, do you realize this is where the gap is? Do you recognize this is where the risk is? Does it make sense to try to move compliance in a different direction or not? And if there is some resistance, find out what that resistance is. If they're saying, I don't have enough staff, maybe help give them the staff that they need to get the job done. So there's a lot of different techniques, but, talking to people, I think, is incredibly helpful, especially when you talk about changing the culture to a more compliance-centric culture.
Got it. All right. I hope that answers your questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking part in it. And thank you, Matthew. We wrap up the webinar now. It's been a pleasure speaking with you and also to learn how to scale multiple frameworks beyond SOC 2. It was extremely informative. And yes, Fred has just added Matthew's socials here. So please connect with him on LinkedIn and follow his posts. He talks a lot more about information security. So you would definitely benefit from it. And we at Sprinto are a GRC automation platform who have also been helping customers scale multiple frameworks with ease. Relative ease, as you can expect from technology, but definitely check us out. Oh, sorry, there is one more question, Shekhar. There's just one last question. How can SME companies benefit from SOC 2? Is it expensive to adopt for them? Matthew, there's just one last question. I just wanted to make sure that we answer all of it.
So for small, medium businesses, enterprises, it depends on the size of the enterprise. I've seen, four-person companies even become high trust. It's highly unlikely. It takes a lot of work, and it means everybody getting together and working together to get something done. But it just depends. It can be, but it depends on how far you want to go. Like, for example, and I've looked at the costs on just doing the assessment itself. I've seen everything as cheap as like, $15,000. I've heard if you work with companies in foreign countries, you can even get like $5,000 assessments. But I also know sometimes there's some challenges. But I've also seen the $500,000 SOC 2 assessments. And that's the other extreme side of the house. And when you're talking about that, you do get what you pay for, and they're going to give you a little bit more of white glove service. But is it really valuable to your organization? Is it important to get the checkbox approach? And can you put up with a few little bumps along the way? Are you going to be frustrated at certain times? Yes, but if you've at least got the basics in place, those are a few things that you can consider. for the most part, when you look at I'm going to say the average company without going for the high-end companies, you can talk about, $20,000 for SOC 2 is not unheard of, but definitely I've seen them going up from there. If you start to add in other frameworks, that can definitely change as well.
Shekhar, I hope that answered your question. With that, yes, we should definitely wrap it because our 30 minutes are up. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in and tuning in from multiple platforms. I'll see you all in the next webinar. Take care. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.